Walk Two Moons, Chapter 40, Homecoming. The next morning Phoebe phoned, begging me to come over. I can't stand it, she said. I want a witness. For what? I just want a witness. Did you tell your father about your mother and... Are you kidding? Phoebe said. You should see him. He and Prudence spent all last night and this morning cleaning the house. They scrubbed floors and bathrooms. They dusted like fiends. They did ever so much laundry and ironing, and they vacuumed. Then they took a good look around. My father said, maybe it looks too good. Your mother will think we can function without her. So they messed things up a little. He is very put out with me that I wouldn't help. I tried to think of a good reason why I could not go to Phoebe's. I did not want to be a witness to anything, but in the end I felt guilty for running away the day before, and so I agreed. When I got to her house, Phoebe, Mr. Winterbottom, and Prudence were sitting there staring at each other. Didn't she say what time she was coming? Mr. Winterbottom asked. Prudence said no, she did not, and I wish you would quit acting as if it is my fault that she did not say more than she did. Mr. Winterbottom was a wreck. He jumped up to straighten a pillow, sat back down. Then he leaped up to mess up the pillow again. He went out in the yard and walked around in circles. He changed his shirt twice. I hope you don't mind that I'm here, I said. Why would I mind? Mr. Winterbottom said. Just as I thought they would all go stark raving mad, a taxi pulled up outside. I can't look, Mr. Winterbottom said, escaping to the kitchen. I can't look either, Phoebe said. She followed her father, and I followed Phoebe. Well, gosh, Prudence said. I don't know what has gotten into everybody. Aren't you excited to see her? From the kitchen we heard Prudence open the front door. We heard Mrs. Winterbottom say, Oh, sweetie. Mr. Winterbottom wiped the kitchen counter. We heard Prudence gasp and her mother say, I'd like you to meet Mike. Mike? Mr. Winterbottom said. He was quite red in the face, and I was glad there was no axe in the house, or I am fairly certain he would have picked it up and headed straight for Mike. Phoebe said, Now, Dad, don't do anything too rash. Mike, he repeated. Mrs. Winterbottom called George, Phoebe. We heard her say to Prudence, Where are they? Didn't you tell them we were coming? Mr. Winterbottom took a deep breath. He said, Phoebe, I'm not sure you or Sal should be around for this. Are you kidding? Phoebe said. He took another deep breath. Okay, he said. Okay, here we go. He stood up straight and tall and walked to the living room. Phoebe and I followed. Honestly and truly, I think Phoebe nearly fainted dead away on the carpet. There were two reasons for this. The first one was that Mrs. Winterbottom looked different. Her hair was not only short, but also quite stylish. She was wearing lipstick, mascara, and a little blush on her cheeks, and her clothes were altogether unlike anything I had ever seen her in. A white T-shirt, blue jeans, and flat black shoes. Dangling from her ears were thin silver hoop earrings. She looked magnificent, but she did not look like Phoebe's mother. The second reason that I think Phoebe nearly fainted dead away was that there was Mike Bickle, Phoebe's potential lunatic, in her own living room. It was one thing to think he was coming, and another thing to actually see him standing there. I didn't know what to think. For a second I thought maybe Mike had kidnapped Mrs. Winterbottom and was bringing her back for some ransom money. Or maybe he was now going to do away with the rest of us. But I kept thinking of seeing them together the day before, and besides, Mrs. Winterbottom looked too terrific to have been held captive. Mrs. Winterbottom did look a little frightened, but not of Mike. She seemed afraid of her husband. Dad, Phoebe whispered, that's the lunatic. Oh, Phoebe, her mother said, pressing her fingers to her cheek, and when she made that familiar gesture, Phoebe looked as if her heart was splitting into 1,000 pieces. Mrs. Winterbottom hugged Phoebe, but Phoebe did not hug her back. Mr. Winterbottom said, Norma, I hope you are going to explain exactly what is going on here. He was trying to make his voice firm, but it trembled. Prudence stood there staring at Mike. She seemed to find him quite handsome and was flirting with him. She fluffed her hair away from her neck. Mrs. Winterbottom went up to Mr. Winterbottom and tried to put her arms around him, but he pulled away. I think we deserve an explanation, he said. He was staring at Mike. So was I. I was quite confused. Was she in love with Mike? And if she was in love with him, he seemed awfully young. He didn't seem much older than Prudence. Mrs. Winterbottom sat down on the sofa and began to cry. It was a terrible, terrible moment. It was thumpingly hard to make any sense out of what she said at first. She was talking about being respectable and how maybe Mr. Winterbottom would never forgive her, but she was tired of being so respectable. She said she had tried very, very hard all these years to be perfect. but that she had to admit she was quite imperfect. She said there was something that she had never told her husband, and she feared he would not forgive her for it. Mr. Winterbottom's hands were trembling. He did not say anything. Mrs. Winterbottom motioned for Mike to join her on the sofa. Mr. Winterbottom cleared his throat several times, but still he said nothing. Mrs. Winterbottom said, "This is my son." I think that Mr. Winterbottom, Prudence, Phoebe, and I all said exactly the same time, "Your son?" Mrs. Winterbottom stared at her husband. "George," she said, "I know you will think I am not or was not respectable, but it was just before I met you, and I had to give him up for adoption, and I could hardly bear to think of it, and..." Mr. Winterbottom said, "Respectable? Respectable? The hell with respectable." Mr. Winterbottom did not normally swear. Mrs. Winterbottom stood up. "Mike found me, and at first I was frightened of what that would mean. I've lived such a tiny life." Phoebe took her father's hand. "And I had to go away and sort things out. I haven't yet met Mike's adoptive parents, but Mike and I have spent a lot of time talking. And I've been thinking." Mike sat there looking down at his feet. "Are you going to leave?" Mr. Winterbottom asked. Mrs. Winterbottom looked as if he had slapped her. "Leave?" she said. "Again, I mean," Mr. Winterbottom said. "Only if you want me to," she said. "Only if you cannot live with such an unrespectable..." "I said to hell with respectable," Mr. Winterbottom said. "What's all this about respectable? It's not respectable I'm concerned about. I'm more concerned that you couldn't or wouldn't tell me about any of this." Mike stood up. "I knew it wouldn't work," he said. Mr. Winterbottom said, "I have nothing against you, Mike. I just don't know you." He looked at his wife. "I don't think I know you either." I was wishing and I was invisible. I stared out the window at the leaves falling to the ground, and I was infinitely sad down to my bones. I was sad for Phoebe and her parents and Prudence and Mike. I was sad for the leaves that were dying, and I was sad for myself, for something I had lost. I saw Mrs. Partridge out front standing on Phoebe's front walk. Mr. Winterbottom said, "I think we all need to sit down and talk. Maybe we can sort something out." Then he did what I think was a noble thing. He went over to Mike and shook his hands and said, "I did always think a son would be a nice addition to this family." Mrs. Winterbottom looked extensively relieved. Prudence smiled at Mike. Phoebe stood quite still off to the side. "I'd better go," I said. Everyone turned to me as if I had just dropped through the roof. Mr. Winterbottom said, "Sal, oh, I am sorry, I truly am." To Mike he said, "Sal is like another member of the family." Mrs. Winterbottom went over to Phoebe. "You're mad at me, aren't you, Phoebe?" "Yes," Phoebe said, "I most certainly am." Phoebe took my sleeve and pulled me toward the door. She turned back around to say, "When you all decide exactly how many people are in this family, let me know." Phoebe pulled me out onto the porch just as Mrs. Partridge placed a white envelope on the steps. Chapter 41, The Gifts. It seemed fitting that at this point in my story of Phoebe, Gramps called out, "Idaho!" We were high in the mountains and had just crossed the Montana border into Idaho. For the first time, I believed we were going to make it to Lewiston by the next day, the 20th of August, my mother's birthday. Gramps suggested we press on to Coeur d'Alene, but about an hour away, where we could spend the night. From there, Lewiston was about 100 miles due south, an easy morning's journey. How does that sound to you, Gooseberry? Gram was sitting motionless, with her head resting against the back of the seat and her hands folded on her lap. "Gooseberry?" When Gram spoke, she could hear the rattle in her chest. You could hear the rattle in her chest. "Oh, that's fine," she said. "Gooseberry, are you feeling okay?" "I'm a little tired," she said. "We'll get you to bed real soon." Gramps glanced back at me, and I could see that he was troubled. "Gram, if you want to stop now, that would be okay," I said. "Oh, no," she said. I'd like to sleep in Coeur d'Alene tonight. Your mama sent us a postcard from Coeur d'Alene, and on it was a beautiful blue lake." She coughed a long, rattly cough. Gramps said, "Okay then, beautiful blue lake, here we come." Gram said, "I'm so glad Peebee's mama came home. I wish your mama could come home too." Gramps nodded his head for about 5 minutes. Then he handed me a tissue and said, "Tell us about Mrs. Partridge. What was she doing leaving a gall-dang envelope on Peebee's porch?" That's what Phoebe and I wanted to know. When we stepped out the door, Mrs. Partridge tilted her head up at us. "Did you want something, Mrs. Partridge?" I asked. She put her hand to her lips. She said. Phoebe snatched the envelope and ripped it open. She read the message out loud. Don't judge a man until you've walked 2 moons in his moccasins. Mrs. Partridge turned to go. Bye-bye, she said. Mrs. Partridge, Phoebe called. We've already had this one. I beg your pardon, Mrs. Partridge said. It was you, wasn't it? Phoebe said. You've been creeping around leaving these things, haven't you? Did you like them? Mrs. Partridge said, as she stood there in the middle of the sidewalk with her head tilted up at us, and that quizzical look on her face. She looked like a mischievous child. Margaret reads them to me from the paper each day, and when there is a nice one, I ask her to copy it down. I'm sorry I gave you that one about the moccasins already. My noggin forgot. But why did you bring them here? Phoebe said. I thought they would be a grandiful surprises for you, like fortune cookies, only I didn't have any cookies to put them in. Did you like them anyway? Phoebe looked at me for a long minute. Then she went down the steps and said, Mrs. Partridge, when was it you met my brother? You said you didn't have a brother, Mrs. Partridge said. I know, but you said you met him. When was that? She tapped her head. Noggin, remember, let's see, some time ago, a week, 2 weeks? He came to my house by mistake, I suppose. He let me feel his face, that's why I thought he was your brother. He has a similar face. Isn't that peculiar? Phoebe looked back toward her house. She said, No, more peculiar than most things lately. Mrs. Partridge tottered on down the walk and back to her house. Phoebe stood there looking all around. It's a peculiar world, Sal, she said, and then she walked across the grass and spit into the street. She said, Come on, try it. I spit into the street. What do you think? Phoebe said. We spit again. It might sound somethingly disgusting, but to tell the truth, we got a great deal of pleasure from those spits. I doubt if I ever could explain why that was, but for some reason it seemed the perfect thing to do. And when Phoebe turned around and went into the house, I knew that that was the right thing for her to do too. With the courage of that spit in me, I went to see Margaret Cadaver, and we had a long talk, and that's when I found out how she met my father. It was painful to talk with her, and I even cried in front of her, but afterwards I understood why my father liked to be with her. Ben was sitting on my front steps when I got home. I was extensively glad to see him. He said, I brought you something. It's out back. He led me around the side of the house, and there, strutting across that little patch of grass, was a chicken. I was never in my life so happy to see a chicken. Ben said, I named it, but you can change the name if you want. When I asked him what its name was, he leaned forward and I leaned forward, and another kiss happened. A spectacular kiss. An extensively perfect kiss. And Ben said, Its name is Blackberry. Oh, Graham said, is that the end of the Peavy story? Yes, I said. That wasn't quite true. I suppose as I could have told more. I could have told about Phoebe getting adjusted to having a brother, and Phoebe getting adjusted to her new mother, and all that, but that part was still going on, even as we traveled through the mountains. It was a whole different story. Well, I like that story about Peavy, and I'm glad it wasn't too awfully sad, and I think you should write it down someday. Graham closed her eyes, and for the next hour, as Gramps drove toward Coeur d'Alene, he and I listened to her rattly breathing. I watched her lying there so still, so calm. Gramps, I whispered, she looks a little gray, doesn't she? Yes, she does, Chickabiddy. Yes, she does. He stepped on the gas, and we raced toward Coeur d'Alene.